statement on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Can I invite any members who wish to do so to leave quietly, please? Minister.
With permission, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to update the House on the humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. A tragedy is unfolding. Israel has suffered the worst terrorist attack in its history. Palestinian civilians in Gaza are experiencing a devastating humanitarian crisis, and violence is rising in the West Bank. The best estimates emerging from a confused situation are that 2.3 million people need access to safe drinking water, food supplies are running out, 1/3 of hospitals have been forced to shut down, and 1.5 million people are displaced. I know the whole House shares my pain in seeing so many innocent lives destroyed on and since October the 7th. Britain is working intensively to get more aid into Gaza, to support the safe return of hostages and British nationals, to back Israel's right to self-defence, and to prevent a dangerous regional escalation. My right honourable friends, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, have been engaging extensively, and Lord Ahmed has been constantly in the region. This morning I met a group of charities and NGOs involved in getting life-saving support into Gaza. And I spoke yesterday to the Jordanian and Lebanese and Egyptian ambassadors, and early this morning once again to Martin Griffiths. I wish also to pay tribute to our diplomats and development experts striving to make a difference in the most difficult of circumstances. Despite, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the many challenges, the whole government is determined to do all that we can to continue to stand up for what is right and do the right thing. Immediately after Hamas's brutal assault, the government brought home almost 1,000 British nationals safely on charter and military flights. But the safety of all British nationals is our utmost priority, and so we are in regular contact with those in Gaza registered with us since the conflict began. Working with partners, we've been engaging intensively with Israel and Egypt to allow foreign nationals to leave Gaza via the Rafah border crossing. This has proved possible on 5 of the last 7 days, and I can confirm to the House that as of late last night, over 150 British nationals have made it through to Egypt. A forward-deployed team of consular officials is in El Arish, close to Rafah, to meet them and provide the medical, consular and administrative support they need. We have also set up a reception centre for British nationals in Cairo and have arranged accommodation. We will do everything we can to ensure all remaining British nationals in Gaza can leave safely. Sadly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, amongst the British nationals in Gaza are some held hostage by Hamas, among the over 200 innocents cruelly kidnapped on the 7th of October. Their plight is a stark reminder of what Hamas represents. The terrorists continue to launch rockets relentlessly at Israeli homes and families. Their stated aim, repeated publicly in recent weeks, is the destruction of the Israeli state and the eradication of their people. And that is why the government unequivocally supports Israel's right to defend itself. However, we have also repeatedly stressed that Israel must take every precaution to minimise civilian casualties in line with international humanitarian law. We continue to press Israel to ensure its campaign is targeted against Hamas leaders, militants and military infrastructure. And we condemn settler violence. Israel needs to take concrete measures to address it and hold the perpetrators to account. All parties to a conflict must ensure that their actions are proportionate and necessary, affording innocent civilians the protection that is their right under international law. Who can doubt that this is true, because the Palestinian people are also the victims of Hamas? My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has expressed his condolences to the President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, for the deaths of Palestinian civilians caught in the aftermath of Hamas's attack. Since the 7th of October, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the UK has made available £30 million in additional aid to the occupied Palestinian territories, more than doubling our existing aid commitment for this year. So far, 3 UK flights carrying a total of 51 tonnes of aid have landed in Egypt. The shipments included life-saving items such as wound care packs, water filters and solar-powered lights. We have also sent humanitarian advisors and vital equipment, including forklift trucks, belt conveyors and lighting towers, specifically requested by the Egyptian Red Crescent Society, to help them manage and deliver all the international aid received in Egypt more effectively. For this aid to meet escalating needs, however, it must enter Gaza and do so in much greater quantity. The government has been working closely with partners, including the United Nations and ICRC, as well as the Egyptian and Israeli governments, to achieve this. Since the 21st of October, a limited number of trucks of aid have crossed into the Strip, but the volume going through the Rafah checkpoint is nowhere near enough to meet civilian needs and cannot be, even were it operating at full capacity. We are therefore urgently exploring with partners measures which can help increase the flow of humanitarian support. These measures must include effective humanitarian pauses, as agreed by all the G7 countries in Tokyo this morning. And we are urging Israel to consider utilising the facilities at other land border crossings into Gaza, such as Kerem Shalom. This reflects our current assessment that delivery by land remains the only safe option to deliver aid in the quantity needed in Gaza, whilst ensuring the necessary control and oversight. Control and oversight matters given the absolute imperative of ensuring aid reaches those in need and is not diverted or misused. Aid diversion is a real risk, more so during conflicts, so I would like to set out to the House how we are managing those risks. All UK aid undergoes rigorous oversight. No funding goes to Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. Our humanitarian programme in the occupied Palestinian territories already operates with enhanced sensitivity, with the government having introduced additional safeguards in 2017. These include measures to verify and map downstream partners, non-payment of local taxes and enhanced due diligence processes. We constantly review the due diligence assessments in place with all partners involved in delivering aid in the occupied Palestinian territories. The whole House, Mr. Deputy Speaker, recognises, however, that to prevent further conflict and terrorism and truly alleviate civilian suffering, there must be a political solution to the conflict. This issue is uniquely polarising. We have seen across the world and in our own communities its potential to radicalise. The long-standing British position on the Middle East process is unchanged. We want to see a safe and secure Israel living alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. The urgency of a political track, extraordinarily difficult today, has never been more clear. Both Israelis and Palestinians have a right to live in peace and security. We have, Mr. Deputy Speaker, moral clarity over Israel's right to self-defence, and we reject all forms of anti-Semitism. But we also are committed to discharging our moral duty to alleviate the suffering of ordinary Palestinians, and we reject all forms of Islamophobia. The current turmoil must act as a further impulse towards realising a peaceful future for the region, and the UK will be doing all it can to achieve that. I commend, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Lisa Nanny.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Minister for the copy of his statement and his call last night. 4 weeks on from the horror of the 7th of October, it is hard to comprehend the scale of the devastation in Gaza. Almost 1.5 million people displaced, more than 10,000 people killed, with more trapped under the rubble of destroyed buildings. Every single one of those lives matters. Every single death is a devastating tragedy. And with 2/3 of those dead, women and children, these civilian deaths are not just shocking, they cannot be ignored. Hundreds of thousands of people are crowded into shelters in desperate need of food, water, medicine and fuel. And while we welcome too the 93 trucks that entered through Rafah on the 6th of November, this is completely insufficient to meet the scale of humanitarian need. I was surprised the Minister didn't make more mention of fuel, because this is the urgent priority. Without it, the water cannot flow, the hospitals can't power their incubators, and the food cannot be cooked. The sewage system breakdown is now threatening a major public health crisis. For weeks, the international community has demanded that the siege conditions on Gaza be lifted, but it has still not happened. This is totally unacceptable, and it cannot continue. Both the UN Humanitarian Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, and the United States have made serious efforts to break this deadlock, to provide assurances that Israel needs about fuel diversion. Can he tell the House what efforts the government is making to insist that fuel for humanitarian purposes can get into Gaza? I welcome his update on discussions about Kerem Shalom. But what's his assessment of the speed at which this can be achieved? And can I also urge him again to follow the US example and appoint a humanitarian coordinator to scale up the passage of aid? We all recognise that while rockets and bombs continue to fall, it's impossible to deliver the scale of aid that's needed across the whole of Gaza and to repair the damage, extensive as it is, to water and electricity systems. We all want an end to the violence and the urgent release of hostages. But with Hamas leaders doubling down on their determination to attack Israel, and with Israel ruling out a ceasefire until hostages are released, the reality is that humanitarian pauses are, as Martin Griffiths wrote movingly last week, the only viable prospect. In Cairo last week, ministers and aid agencies impressed on me the urgency of this. Pauses provide not only much needed aid, but space. Space for the basic humanity to bury the dead, space to look past the pain, and space for the dialogue to make progress towards peace more likely. This is needed now, no more delay. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're devastated by the deaths of so many aid workers and UNRWA staff. The highest number of UN aid workers killed in any conflict in the history of the United Nations. And I hope I can join the whole House in mourning their loss and paying tribute to their bravery and their humanity. Safe shelters, safe distribution centres, safe medical facilities, hospitals and emergency service convoys are essential. And I echo his words about the unacceptable nature of settler violence in the West Bank. But will the Minister join with me in reiterating our calls that Israel's clear right to self-defence is not a blank cheque? He's acknowledged himself the importance of international law. Has he raised the protection of hospitals and schools and refugee camps with his Israeli counterparts, and the need for action to be in accordance with international law to protect civilians and ensure safe, unimpeded access for aid? Mr. Deputy Speaker, the average age in Gaza is just 18. Make no mistake, this is a children's war. More children have died in Gaza in 4 weeks than in all of the world's conflicts in each of the last 3 years. There are 1 million children caught up in the devastation who are orphaned and displaced, sleeping outside as the weather grows colder, short of food and forced to drink dirty water. In most conflicts, we would expect children to be evacuated to a safer place to receive care and shelter. What makes this so devastating is that almost uniquely in this conflict, that is not going to happen. And in the face of such an extraordinary threat to children, the international community is obligated to do more. With the Foreign Secretary at the G7 this week, will the government join us in calling for an emergency plan to support the children of Gaza, to prioritise aid to children, safe and protected shelters for food, clean water and medical care as winter sets in? Because this crisis didn't start in Gaza on the 7th of October. Even before then, 2/3 of children were suffering from trauma. But one aid agency that operates in North Sinai and Gaza told me last week that this now stands at 100%. Without a long-term coordinated plan for the children of Gaza, the political solution we need will not be realised and the cycle of violence will not be broken. We can and we must do more.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady very much for her comments and also for the priorities which she has set out in her response. Can I echo her comment about the brave humanitarian workers who have lost their lives? She will remember that we have consistently condemned that in the case of Sudan, and where something like 20 have lost their lives, there are more than 100 humanitarian workers who have lost their lives. Unarmed people putting themselves in harm's way deliberately to help their fellow citizens, and we honour them across the House as she has. Can I also pay tribute to those who are working in the crisis centre in Whitehall? 100 officials or so, nearly all of them volunteers, very young, working triple shifts the night that Rafah opened, working through the night to help British citizens. I pay tribute to them, their spirit and their hard work. She made a particular point about the importance of fuel, and of course she is absolutely right. We are negotiating for it. She will know that Hamas have a lot of fuel in their tunnels, so the fuel could be made available, but we recognise entirely what that fuel is being used for to help in humanitarian purposes, and we are doing our best to negotiate for it. And she will also have seen the G7 statement today, which is very clear on these points. She asks about routes for access, and the American envoy, Mr. Satterfield, has been working non-stop on this to try and work out whether there are other routes using Kerem Shalom and Rafah to speed up, and we will continue to do all of that. She prioritises the importance of pauses, and we completely agree, and we are arguing for humanitarian pauses. But she will also accept that the method within the pause by which you distribute humanitarian support, it's extremely important that we do not make the mistakes we made in Srebrenica, in Rwanda, in northern Iraq, of bringing vulnerable people together and not being able to protect them. So there are very clear guidelines on any pauses and safe spaces that there must be absolute protection for those who go there. She mentioned that support for Israel is not a blank cheque. Of course she is right about that. Good friends deliver hard messages, and they're able to do so precisely because they are good friends. And she talks of children. I saw UNICEF this morning. I recognise entirely the passion with which she raised that point, and we will do everything we can to ensure that the priority of children is recognised in all the humanitarian work that we do. Finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I remind the House of the wise words of our former colleague and former Foreign Secretary, the noble Lord Haig, at the end of his brilliant article in the Times on October the 9th, where he said, "It is no consolation to those caught up in it that this is no strategic masterstroke by Hamas, more a desperate move to fend off a future that is rapidly leaving them behind. We should not forget that the day after this, there will be an urgent need for a political context."
Order. I suspect my successor in the chair will do our utmost to accommodate all members, because we recognise the importance of this subject. But I'd be grateful if honourable members would keep their remarks as brief as possible under the circumstances, in order that we can accommodate everybody. Could I also gently remind the House of the admonition offered by the Speaker yesterday? We're dealing with very sensitive and very emotive issues, and words matter, and the tone of those words matter. And I know that the House is capable of rising to occasions. I trust that this will be one of those. Andrew Slew.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I hope that the government's calls for humanitarian pauses will continue and be insistent The Minister talked about a viable Palestinian state. That requires land. The reality is so much of that land has been lost to illegal settlements. Will the Minister continue to make that point? Because a brighter future will require land to guarantee the peace we all yearn for.
Well, my honourable friend makes an extremely good point. Of course, we will continue, as he suggested, to prioritise the issue of pauses. He will know that in my statement I condemned settler violence, and the Prime Minister did so yesterday in his response to the gracious speech. But what he says is right, and we will not forget that.
Sorry, Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I associate myself with the comments made by the Shadow Front Bench in relation to paying tribute to all the UN and aid workers who have been killed? And the Minister's correct to say and to remind the House that UK nationals are being held hostage by Hamas. That said, in this situation, the Israeli military must follow the laws of war. So has the government made an assessment of Israel's compliance with international human rights law since the 14th of October? On aid, as the Minister mentioned in his statement, hospitals in Gaza are running out of fuel, and the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees is warning that its aid operation will come to a stop shortly if fuel supplies don't get into Gaza, with blood and life-saving equipment also running out. So has the government considered sending military hospital ship to Egypt to help injured men, women and children who have been able to leave Gaza? And finally, the Minister rightly said that there must be a political solution. The Red Cross has said it's not an exaggeration to say it's catastrophic in Gaza, where 4,100 Palestinian children have died at a rate of 180 children per day. So at what point will the UK government join many of us who are asking them to use the leverage to reach that political solution to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for what he has said and the tone of what he has said, and I thank him also for what he said about those brave humanitarian workers who have lost their lives. He asks whether we are aware of the full impact of the running out of supplies within Gaza, and I can assure him that we absolutely are. He makes the point about the importance of following the rules of war and international humanitarian law, and from both front benches the absolute urging of the Israeli government to do that. We note the commitment of the President of Israel in that respect, but of course everyone will be watching to ensure that the rules of war are obeyed.
From the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Saqib Bhatti.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, there isn't a single constituent who I've spoken to who hasn't felt the pain and the tragedy of the 1,400 people who were murdered on October 7th, nor the tragedy unfolding in Gaza. And so can I commend the Minister for all the work that he's doing? I know him, I know he'll be working incredibly hard to make sure there's no stone left unturned. Will he confirm that in the future, if aid needs to increase, that will continue? And can he also confirm, does he share my concern about the risk of this conflict expanding because of the presence of Hezbollah and their 100,000 soldiers and 150,000 rockets, and the risk that poses to the region?
Well, I thank him very much for his comments. We have doubled the amount of aid that is going into the region, but we will increase it further if it is necessary to do so. And we are doing a lot of work at the moment in trying to work out how we quantify what is in Al Arish and how we make sure that it's able to be moved, because the physical moving of the aid is also a factor, and it's why Britain has sent 5 forklift trucks and a conveyor belt to help with this. The point he makes about regional expansion is, of course, an enormous worry for all of us. It's one of the reasons why the Prime Minister decided to send both air and naval assets to the eastern end of the Mediterranean, to RAF Akrotiri, so that we are able to see what is being moved and interdict any arms that are coming in, and to make sure that we do everything we can to ensure that this conflict is contained and does not expand further.
Rupa Harper.
Thank you, Sir Roger, 10,000 in a month with, as we've heard, UN staff, buildings, hospitals, journalists, third oldest church in Christendom unspared since Hamas's deadly atrocities. With 230 plus hostages still in captivity, could the minister, he talked about being a critical friend, maybe urge the Netanyahu administration that statements like the one about permanent Gazan takeover and even, some ministers not ruling out nukes are only losing them support? And has he got any advice for my constituent? His sister is a survivor of a family mostly wiped out when they moved south, as instructed to, who says, we don't just want to manage to eat before dying under rubble.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her comment. As far as the hostages are concerned, she will appreciate that we do not give a running commentary on those negotiations, but she may rest assured that we are working very closely, including with Qatar, to secure their release. And she will have seen the condemnation of the nuclear comment that was made by a senior Israeli. And on the subject of what happens after the conflict is over, she will have seen the very constructive comments that have been made not only by some of the surrounding Arab leaders, but also by President Blinken when he addressed that point.
Theresa Villiers.
I appreciate that the Minister is limited in what he can share about sensitive diplomatic matters, but will he assure the House that the UK Government is doing everything possible to work with allies to negotiate the return of the hostages?
Yes, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I'm sorry, Chair Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As we see the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza, the terrible images of the dying, the displaced, the maimed, our focus must be on getting humanitarian aid to them, a humanitarian pause for them. But as we look forward to a time when the fighting, the bombing stops, does he agree that the lack of focus on progressing a two-state solution over the last decade and more was a failure on the part of the international community? And can he set out something of what he will be doing to bring renewed focus on a just political settlement to the conflict in the region?
Well, I can say to her that the Foreign Office, the British government, is very focused on how to re-energise the peace process when the opportunity presents itself. And she will have seen that the comments that have been made both about a civil administration in Gaza and what is necessary to secure peace when that point arrives. And I would say to her this, that it is important to note that the huge progress, ultimately unsuccessful, that was made at Oslo took place on the back of the First Intifada. And it may therefore be that there will be an opportunity, given the disaster that has taken place, to re-energise that political track. And we must make sure that if that opportunity presents itself, we grasp it with both hands.
This is something that unites the House more than divides it. Certainly over the issue of the horrors that's going on in Palestine right now and what caused it. And we all recognise the personal commitment of the Minister to humanitarian aims and particularly to humanitarian pauses. But does he agree with me that those who call for ceasefire must recognise that Hamas is a terrorist organisation? And as was said by the member for East Antrim yesterday, terrorist organisations only go for ceasefires when they suit their own regrouping, not to end violence.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend very much for his comments. And of course, he is absolutely right. And for those who call for a ceasefire, of course, we all recognise the motivation and why they are doing it. But at this time, in this situation, it is perfectly clear that Hamas have no intention of engaging in a ceasefire. Indeed, they have repeatedly made clear that their intention is to repeat the awful events of October the 7th. So I agree entirely with both his understanding and his prediction of the situation.
Myself and many of my constituents continue to be upset beyond words by the human suffering that we see on the television screen since the 7th of October. So often now I'm being asked to take sides. But in the words of Jonathan Friedland, this is not a football match. This is two peoples with deep wounds howling with grief, fated to share the same small piece of land. Does the Minister agree that the side we need to be on is the side of all of those who are working towards a lasting peace?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady is entirely correct in her last point, indeed in all that she said, and she says that her constituents are upset beyond measure. One thing we can all agree, wherever you stand on this issue, is that everyone is upset beyond measure, and therefore she is right to say that we must focus, whenever the opportunity presents itself, on the political track and all the opportunities that then could open up.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his long-standing work in this area. The Shadow Minister spoke of fuel and water. On the 7th of October, amidst Hamas's atrocities in Israel, the terrorist group made a concerted effort to destroy water and electricity lines from Israel into Gaza, while Israel has apparently reopened 2 of the 3 water lines into Gaza now. The third remains heavily damaged, as do the power lines. Does my right honourable friend share my concern that Hamas deliberately seeks to worsen the humanitarian conditions inside Gaza?
Minister.
Yes, I thank my right honourable and learned friend for his comments. Of course, he is right. But once again, I draw his attention to the words of the former Foreign Secretary, Lord Haig, who so accurately, so soon after these awful events took place, predicted the reasons why Hamas were doing it and why ultimately they must fail.
Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you. Sir Roger, I welcome the Minister's statement and my honourable friend's response. Will the Minister distance himself from the description of the Palestine marchers as hate-filled? Yeah. Constituents I've been talking to are decent, law-abiding families with no truck at all with Hamas, but horrified by the scenes they're seeing, children killed and maimed day after day on their screens, and wanting it, as we all must, to stop. Will he distance himself from that description?
Minister.
Well, the rights of protest are a much cherished right in this country, and of course, they are enshrined in law, and we respect that. In terms of what the Home Secretary said, we are all responsible for what we say, and she said it in the way that she did.
Richard Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I firstly just thank the Minister, all his team, the United Nations agencies involved, Martin Griffiths, the people in UNRWA on the ground who are obviously in mourning at the moment for their colleagues, for all their incredible work to help on humanitarian aid. But does my right honourable friend agree that, in a sense, this is an intractable problem because the nature of Hamas and how it is based in Gaza makes it impossible for Israel to defend itself effectively without surely breaking the rules of engagement and causing casualties which everyone here finds very hard to accept? And therefore, does he agree with me that the smidgen of hope in all of this is that this disaster, which could repeat itself time and time and again, must surely be the catalyst for those in the region, above all, to lead on finding a proper political solution?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is entirely correct in what he says, and I hope that he will agree with my Oslo analogy and think that that should give us all, at a very dark time, some hope. He is entirely right in what I take him to have meant, that Hamas can play no part in the future of Gaza after what has happened. And I would like to thank him very much for his comments about UN agencies and officials. There's no doubt that the United Nations, and in particular UNRWA and UN OCHA, are working incredibly hard. And I last spoke to Martin Griffiths just after 2 o'clock this morning, and I can tell you that every sinew is bent within the UN trying to end what is a horrific state of affairs so accurately set out across the House.
Dan Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. heartbreakingly, the number of children killed in Gaza over just 4 weeks of Israeli bombardment has surpassed the number in global conflict zones for every year since 2019. So we must urgently work for peace, a two-state solution, however difficult that may seem, and to urgently deal with the humanitarian crisis engulfing Gaza. But it also pains me to see that the death toll in occupied West Bank, which I recently visited, is rapidly rising, including an Israeli airstrike on a mosque and more deadly settler violence. Those victims are certainly not Hamas. So will the Minister join me in condemning settler violence, the extremist rhetoric, and ensure that those perpetrators are held to account?
He is absolutely right to ask us to condemn settler violence. The Prime Minister did it yesterday when he addressed the House. I did it in my statement, and it's been done from the opposition front bench as well. And he is also right in saying that violence in the West Bank has reached unprecedented levels, and we are doing everything we can to urge restraint and to ensure that that stops. And in what he said about children, he speaks for the whole House. The analysis of the problem is the easy part, but we are all working for the resolution.
Robin Walker.
On that point of children, I welcome both the statements from the front bench. My honourable friend is right to focus on every civilian life that has been lost in this conflict, and the honourable lady opposite was right to highlight the importance of children in this. I'd remind the House that the full wording of the Balfour Declaration included the words, "It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done but may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." Children's rights should be at the heart of that, and so therefore can I urge my right honourable friend to double down on the push for humanitarian pauses, on the push for humanitarian access to make sure we can protect children's right to life and right to education.
Minister.
I thank him very much for his comments, with which I entirely agree, and also with his recollection of the Balfour Declaration.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
I am told by the Muslim Council of Wales that 7 families in Wales have lost immediate family members in Palestine, some having lost children and grandchildren. We fear for the Israeli hostages in Gaza, among them British citizens. More will lose their lives, which is why Plaid Cymru has tabled a motion in the Senedd calling on the international community to seek an immediate ceasefire. In advocating humanitarian pauses, does he recognise that innocent non-combatants in Gaza will again be killed when pauses cease, and that the only way to achieve lasting peace is a ceasefire?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady will have heard what I and indeed the front bench have said about ceasefires, but I want to say that the hearts of the whole House will go out to the 7 families, and maybe others too, in Wales who have lost family members.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The atrocities on the 7th of October were well planned, well resourced, and indeed Hamas, the terrorist group, stockpiled in advance, knowing what the response would be from Israel. Equally, at the same time, Hamas had been caught out, putting injured terrorists through the Rafah crossing into Egypt. Will my right friend assess the position of what Hamas should do now to release those resources they've stockpiled so that the humanitarian effort can go much wider than currently is the case?
Minister.
My honourable friend is right and knows a great deal about these issues. And he is right about the atrocities committed on October the 7th by Hamas. This was a pogrom. It was the worst loss of Jewish life at any time in one day since the Holocaust and since 1945. And one of the reasons why the Rafah crossing is so difficult is precisely because of the circumstances which he described, with the misuse of the rules by injured Hamas terrorists.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. According to Gaza's Ministry of Health, more than 10,000 people have been killed by Israeli forces in the past month. That's 1 of every 200 residents of Gaza. This doesn't include everyone who may have died due to lack of clean water or the collapse of the healthcare system after fuel was cut off. Mr. Deputy Speaker, How many more people must die before the government joins the UN Secretary-General, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, Save the Children, Oxfam and the UN General Assembly in calling for an immediate ceasefire?
Minister.
Well, once again, Mr Deputy Speaker, she will have heard the views of both front benches on the issue of a ceasefire, but her comments underline the importance now of trying to achieve these humanitarian pauses so that help and succour can be brought to those who are suffering.
Vicky Ford.
Deputy Speaker, the loss of life in Israel and Palestine is beyond horror, and everybody wants it to stop. But the statement from Hamas that they will not stop until the people of Israel are annihilated is deeply chilling. In his statement, he mentioned radicalisation, and there is concern that the greater the loss of civilian life, the greater the risk of radicalisation. So can I also thank him for saying so clearly that Israel must take precautions to minimise civilian casualties. I would add that Israel needs to be seen to be taking such precautions. We've continually called for pausing in the fighting to let aid in and people out. What assessment has he made of the likelihood of such pauses actually happening?
Minister.
Well, I don't think I can give a running commentary on that, except to say that the sinews of everybody are bent towards achieving it. She makes a very good point that from all this death, destruction and killing, we must guard against the radicalisation of an entire new generation of young people. As I think President Biden said, it's very important that the lessons of 9/11 are properly learned.
David Linden.
Those of us who do support a ceasefire get the overwhelming message from both the government and the Labour front bench that somehow calling for a ceasefire is naive. So can I ask the Minister, does he think that the Pope is naive in calling for a ceasefire in Gaza?
Minister.
I've set out very clearly our understanding and our logic and the reasons why we, and not just we, but also the opposition front bench, have reached the conclusions that we have on a ceasefire, and I hope that at the very least he will reflect upon those.
Anthony Higginbotham.
Speaker, getting aid into Gaza is vital, and I welcome the Minister's statement about looking for additional border crossings. But what's more important is making sure that once aid is in Gaza, it gets to the people who need it most. Reports suggest that Hamas are hoarding more than 200,000 gallons of fuel. That is fuel that could be used for generators, to power hospitals, fuel that could be used for ambulances. So could I ask what the government's assessment is of Hamas's holding of fuel and what steps we're taking to make sure that once aid gets into Gaza, it doesn't end up in the hands of Hamas?
Minister.
Well, he is right that we know that Hamas has hoarded fuel in Gaza. I can't give him a statistic. He himself gave one to the House. That may or may not be right, but we do know that they do have this stockpiling of fuel. And in terms of the way in which support will be used once we get these pauses and once we're able to get help and humanitarian supplies into Gaza, I can tell him that we are very, very careful indeed. We never work through the Palestinian Authority or through Hamas in terms of direct support. We only go through trusted organisations, and we are very careful indeed to ensure that we, as I set out in my statement, that the aid gets to those who need it and gets there directly.
Nurse Shah.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the United Nations Secretary-General has said Gaza is resembling a graveyard for children. More than 4,000 have been killed since the start of this conflict. Every day we see footage of heartbreaking stories. I watched a small girl being pulled out of the rubble, asking her uncle if she was dead and whether he was taking her to a graveyard. Another video showed a girl, barely 5, stuck under a collapsed building, praying her final prayers in preparation for her death. Mr Deputy Speaker, children at their age should be not asking whether they are going to a graveyard, but whether they're going to a playground or buying ice cream or doing the usual things, not going to a graveyard and preparing for their death. Children outside Al-Shifa Hospital yesterday felt they needed to do a press conference to call on the world to let them live. So, Minister, when will the UK ramp up its effort to end the bloodshed and ensure Palestinian children just have the right to live?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady speaks with the greatest possible eloquence, and she speaks for the whole House in saying that what is happening to children in Gaza appalls us all. I just ask her to consider the wider context and accept that the government understands and agrees with her analysis of the plight of children in Gaza and will do everything within the wider context to try and bring that to an end.
Lick Drummond.
Much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I refer members to my register of interest concerning my visit to Israel and Palestine in May this year? I received a report from a surgeon at a hospital in Gaza today. He says the situation is beyond catastrophic. We're seeing horrific injuries and the majority are children. The type of injuries we are seeing is not something a human mind can accept or tolerate. People being pulled live from the rubble are scratched and bleeding and full of flies. A lot of his report's very graphic, including the fact that many children have lost limbs and no one knows who many of them are. Now, the UK is the penholder for the protection of civilians in conflict at the UN Security Council. Can we ensure that all health facilities, including the Indonesian hospital in Gaza, which apparently was at threat at being bombed, be protected from attack?
Minister.
She's entirely right to refer to the UK role at the United Nations, and we take those responsibilities extremely seriously, and our brilliant team who work at the UN are doing everything to justify the fact that we hold that particular pen among any others. And in terms of the treatment of hospitals, she will have heard what the Prime Minister has said about that, and we will continue to do everything we can to protect them.
Ben Bradshaw.
I welcome the balance and tone of the Minister's statement. When the government makes representations to the Israeli government about the increase in settler violence in the West Bank, what does the Israeli government say in return?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, these are ongoing discussions and they are made at many levels. The Prime Minister has spoken repeatedly to Prime Minister Netanyahu. My colleague, the Noble Lord Ahmed, has been consistently in the region, and the Foreign Secretary likewise. So we are having those discussions at every level, but he may rest assured that what the Prime Minister has said, what I have said from the dispatch box, that is the thrust of these discussions, and we're doing everything we possibly can to drive forward what he and I both share as the right answer to this.
Nicky Akin.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is incredibly difficult to hear the testimonies of the survivors of the 7th of October Hamas atrocities, and it is equally difficult to see the media reports of what is happening in Gaza, and particularly the children that are being affected. It is so important that we do all we can to bring this conflict to an end for the security and the futures of children in both Israel and in Gaza. I welcome the extra humanitarian aid that is going into Gaza from the UK government. Can the Minister please assure us that once this conflict is over and an even bigger humanitarian aid will be required, that the government will do all it can to help rebuild Gaza?
Minister.
Well, on her final point, there is no doubt that when peace comes and the international community is able to engage in a political process, the rebuilding of Gaza will certainly be part of that. And to her point about the awful testimonies of survivors from the 7th of October, and indeed the dreadful scenes we see on our television, thanks to the brave reportage of many journalists, there is no doubt that it is extremely difficult to watch, and that is why the government, along with our allies and others who are deeply concerned about this, are doing everything they can to ensure that we bring it to a close as soon as we can.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Deputy Speaker, 1,400 dead in Israel, 10,000 dead in Gaza.
increased military activity on the West Bank, increased settler violence, and now more and more children dying as this conflict goes on in Gaza. And Prime Minister Netanyahu now promising that Israel will control the Gaza Strip in the indefinite future. Isn't it time the British government joined with all those other sensible, reasonable voices around the world that are doing everything they can to demand and get a ceasefire to prevent any further loss of life and begin to work out a peaceful future for all of the people in the region?
Minister.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman will have heard what his successor as the leader of the Labour Party has said on the subject of ceasefire, and we agree with what the leader of the opposition has said about that. But he describes an extraordinarily difficult situation, and he also talks about security on the West Bank. I think the issue of security on the West Bank, the key purpose for Israel is that the rockets cannot come over the border again. And I think you need to see security in that context rather than in the ebb and flow of the debate that's going on at the moment.
Sarah Bickliffe.
Speaker, we know that escalation is a real risk. And with reports that Israeli forces have started raiding refugee camps in the West Bank, we know there's a real risk to innocent Palestinians. There are also reports of Israeli settlers in the West Bank becoming increasingly hostile in the occupied Palestinian territories. Can the Minister please explain what specific steps he's taken to de-escalate these situations?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes the point that escalation is not just about the region, it's also about the West Bank as well. And that's why the Prime Minister has condemned settler violence and why we continue to make representations to the Israeli government in that respect.
Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. On the question of humanitarian pauses, what's the Minister's assessment? How long would they last? How would people be protected? How would it be managed? I think the Minister referred briefly to that in his statement.
Well, the aim, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of humanitarian pauses is not only to get humanitarian relief and supplies into Gaza, it's also to ensure that there's a safe structure, as I said earlier in my statement, to deliver humanitarian supplies, and one that does not put people in jeopardy. And therefore, a humanitarian pause should not be seen as one on its own. We are looking at negotiating a series of humanitarian pauses so that there can be a proper supply basis for the people we are trying to help.
French. Bob Butler.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, many constituents have raised concerns with me about the humanitarian crisis faced by Palestinians in Gaza. Indeed, a march was held in Aylesbury on Saturday, which I'm pleased to say passed off peacefully. We know that Hamas hides behind human shields, including, shockingly, even in hospitals. So how is my right honourable friend's department working with partners on the ground in Gaza to ensure the aid does get to those who need it, including in hospitals, despite the barbarity and the barriers put in their place by Hamas?
Minister.
My honourable friend is quite right to raise the importance of ensuring that Hamas brutality does not fetter our ability to get aid through to those who really need it. And I can give him that undertaking, that is precisely what we are trying to do.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you very much. Against the backdrop of a child dying every 10 minutes in Gaza and evidence that water entering as aid through the Rafah crossing is not being allowed into northern Gaza, will the Minister confirm the government supports the independence of the International Criminal Court and recognises its jurisdiction to address the conduct of all parties in the conflict in Gaza?
Minister.
Well, I thank her for her comments about the importance of prioritising children, and in respect of the International Criminal Court, she will know that the government is a very strong supporter of the International Criminal Court and the role that it plays in international affairs.
Heather Wheeler.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, and I agree with every single word of it. In 13 years as being an MP, I've never received such detailed and harrowing letters from my Jewish community and from my Muslim community in South Derbyshire. Whatever else happens, please can we make sure that looking to the future, we work on the two states solution, and we make sure that there is a safe place for all Gazans and all Jewish families going forward.
Minister.
My honourable friend accurately summarises the role and the importance that the government's attached to progressing the political process, and I thank her for her comments in that respect.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Could the Minister tell us whether his discussions with charities and NGOs this morning included aid agencies like Oxfam, Christian Aid or Save the Children, who say that only a full ceasefire can deliver the conditions to get life-saving food and fuel and water and medicine into Gaza, not least because critical infrastructure like roads and hospitals need to be mended first. And this can't happen if they only have humanitarian pauses. I know he said a lot this afternoon about the difference between pauses and a ceasefire, but he's not addressed explicitly the advice that we're hearing from humanitarian experts on the ground who say that it is only a full ceasefire that will allow them to get that kind of aid to the people who need it fast enough.
Minister.
The Honourable Lady is correct about the importance of tackling the deficiencies of infrastructure, both in the area around Rafah, but more extensively than that. She asks about my contact with NGOs and charities. As she said, I had a meeting this morning which was chaired by Bond, which, as she will know, is the collective of these charities. We operate through trusted partners. We're operating through UNICEF, through UNRWA, through UN OCHA. We're in continual contact. And the point she makes about infrastructure is one that we are very much aware of and will do everything we can to assist with.
James Morris.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Minister is absolutely right to say that Hamas made a massive strategic error when they attacked innocent Israeli people on the 7th of October, and they're paying a heavy price with the destruction of their terror network in the Gaza Strip. But would he agree with me that the bigger price that they should pay is that the moderate voices on both sides should come together to re-establish the framework which was in place, as he referred to it, under Oslo, to come towards a two-state solution between a viable Israeli state and a viable Palestinian state, and we get the terror network out of the way?
Minister.
Not just in Britain, but all around the Arab world, all around the United Nations, people are very much focused on how you get a political track going again when these dreadful events draw to a close. And as I said earlier on, I think the one opportunity that may arise from these dreadful events is to try and rebuild the political process to deliver an answer on, he mentions the two-state solution, and that is the bedrock of British government policy, but to address the way we go forward politically.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I spoke to my constituent last night who's studying in York. He has lost 42 members of his wider family, and his immediate family remain in the line of rockets in Gaza. What steps is the government taking to ensure that there can be family reunion and that we can see refugees coming from the Gaza Strip to the UK?
Minister.
Well, we are working very hard to ensure that families are not broken up through the Rafah crossing. We have been moderately successful at that so far. So I am sure that everything that can be done will be done. And of course, if any of her constituents are caught up in that way, I hope that she will let us in the Crisis Centre know through the MP hotline.
Mark Logan.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, first of all, I'd like to put on record my thanks to the Bolton Council of Mosques in Bolton North East and across the town, which covers 34 mosques in the constituency and 60,000 members in Bolton. My constituents have felt very aggrieved over the last month. We've seen statements coming out of Israel around giving security responsibility for Gaza for an indefinite period of time. The Minister did mention that Secretary of State Antony Blinken had said that there shall be no Israeli reoccupation at Gaza after the war. So, first of all, what is our government's position on this in the long term? Secondly, my constituents, through the Bolton Council of Mosque, have called repeatedly for ceasefires. I will be meeting them again tomorrow night. I would just like to see, from our government's perspective, what criteria would have to be met in order for us to call for a ceasefire.
Minister.
My honourable friend, I know, has been in detail deeply engaged in representing his constituents, and I'm aware of the representations he has made. I hope he will explain to his constituents tomorrow night the reasons why a ceasefire is not something which either the government or the opposition are calling for. And I hope that he will be able to explain, when it comes to the issue of pauses, that we are doing everything we can to both construct a scenario where there can be a number of pauses, but also to make sure that the humanitarian support can be safely delivered within Gaza.
Ansel Khan.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the International Committee of the Red Cross has reported, as Gaza loses power, hospitals lose power, putting newborns in incubators and elderly patients on oxygen at risk. Without electricity, hospital risks turning into morgues. So does the Minister not think that at this point, bringing an immediate stop to the violence is the only way to stop hospitals turning into morgues and the whole of Gaza turning into a graveyard?
Minister.
We are extremely concerned, Mr. Deputy Speaker, about the position in hospitals and the effects that he has described. But I can only repeat what I have already said to the House about how we are doing everything we can to try and bring these circumstances to a close.
Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and for the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary for their ongoing diplomatic efforts at this time. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to the brave humanitarian workers doing so much in Gaza? And can he reassure the House again that the UK government is straining every sinew to get as much humanitarian aid into Gaza as quickly as possible?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for once again reiterating the strong support across the House for the brave humanitarian workers and what they are doing in this terrible conflict, and also expressing his abhorrence that unarmed people who are only trying to benefit their fellow humans should be murdered in this way. He can rest assured that we will do everything we possibly can to make sure that they are protected.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Hounslow's Muslim leaders told me and my honourable friend Feltham and Heston yesterday evening of the horror felt in their communities at the atrocities taking place in Gaza, the need for getting aid and support in, and their wish for long-term peace. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, now that Israel is threatening to permanently occupy Gaza, will the UK government support the US Secretary of State Blinken's insistence that there should be no Israeli occupation of Gaza after this war?
Paul Brewster. I beg.
I'm grateful to her for telling the House about her meetings with the Muslim leaders in her constituency. I hope that she will tell them about the position of the House, the aid and support that we are trying to get in through the pauses, and the support for the political process, which she also mentioned. And the British government agrees with Secretary Blinken in what he has said, but are absolutely clear that the perpetrators of the dreadful events, Hamas, on October the 7th, must never be allowed to do it again.
Paul Brewster.
My constituent, Maimon Zomlot, is from Gaza. I met him when he was working there as a chef at a local pizza restaurant. An incredibly nice and genuine guy. But this morning he sent me a text informing me that his family home was destroyed 3 days ago, and he's heard nothing from his family since. How much longer do we have to wait until this suffering ends and humanitarian aid can reach people like my constituent's family?
Minister.
I cannot tell my honourable friend the answer to that question, but I can tell him that we are doing everything we can to make sure that that period of time is as short as possible.
Order. Order. I indicated that I would endeavour to accommodate... Order, please. Sit down. I indicated that I'd endeavour to accommodate everybody. That remains the case. The Minister has indicated to me that he has effectively cleared his diary to accommodate this because he realises how important it is. But there is a time when everything has to come to an end because there is a large number of members particularly on the opposition benches, who wish to speak in the King's Speech debate later. And we want to get those people in as well. I'm going to try and terminate this debate by 2:30. And bear in mind that there are some 38 members still standing. Liam Byrne.
We're grateful to the Minister for his tireless work, but by his own analysis, he says that the aid is not getting through. Can I commend to him the motion that was passed by Birmingham Council last night, which does call for a binding on sides immediate ceasefire, because it's the best way to save the hostages, get aid through, and let the war crimes inspectors do their work. I support that position. I don't think he does. But could he tell us what are the conditions under which the British government will shift from a policy of supporting humanitarian pauses to a strategy of supporting an immediate ceasefire?
Minister.
Well, I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman will explain to our friends on Birmingham City Council the reason why the government, and indeed his own front bench, take the view they do about ceasefires. But he is right to say that the critical, important thing at the moment is to focus on these pauses, humanitarian pauses designed to get food to those who need it. Nothing is more important in that context than that.
Patrick Reid.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, he said in response to my honourable friend that he wants Israel, the government of Israel, to comply with international human rights law, and that he encourages the government of Israel to comply with international human rights law. But he didn't answer his question. Has the government made an assessment of whether or not the government of Israel is complying with international human rights law?
Minister.
Well, it's not for the government, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to make such an assessment. It is for the lawyers and a court to make that assessment. But the critical thing is that Britain makes it clear that all countries must abide by international humanitarian law and the rules of war.
Rushnara Ann.
Thank you, Sir Roger Gale. Over 10,000 people have already been killed in Gaza in the last month, more than were killed in the 1995 Srebrenica genocide, and there are grave concerns that starvation is being used as a weapon of war against 400,000 civilians in the north of Gaza. This is illegal under international law. The UN Secretary-General and a number of others have talked about the need for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza and a halt to the spiral of escalation already taking place from West Bank, Lebanon, Syria and Iraq and Yemen. While I recognise the government's position and across the two main parties on ceasefires, 120 countries in the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian truce. That has not been achieved either. The government talks about humanitarian pauses, yet our government has abstained on UN resolutions. What is the government doing to use its influence at the international level to stop the bombardment so that aid can get in at the very least?
Well, as I set out, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in my statement, we are engaged on all those matters, and we are doing everything we can through Britain's very strong diplomatic network, which means we are engaged and connected to almost all the relevant parties in this matter, and we will continue to do so.
Order. I do have to call upon honourable members to try and keep their questions brief. I want to accommodate everybody, but at the present rate of lengthy questions is simply not going to be possible. Claire Hanna.
And Minister for his thoughtful answers. In 1919, seeing children from the defeated Austrian Empire starving, Eglantine Jebb established Save the Children. Many people said to him, how can you help the enemies of children? And one of his supporters, the great Irish humanitarian George Bernard Shaw, said, I have no enemies under the age of 6. Almost half of Palestinian children, or Palestinians are children, many thousands of whom have been killed and maimed and orphans, and obviously many Israeli children as well, including one dual Irish citizen who is believed to be among the hostages in Gaza. Does the Minister agree with UNICEF's Regional Director, Adele Coder, when she says that the situation in Gaza is a growing stain on our collective conscience?
Well, the head of UNICEF who made those comments is right to focus on what is happening in Gaza and to express her abhorrence for what is taking place. And in respect of her citation for the work, the brilliant work that Save the Children does, I've been intimately connected with Save the Children for the last 20 years, and we honour both their work and the success so often of what they are achieving.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Everybody wants the bloodshed to stop. So the question is how to secure that ambition in a lasting way, not whether we should seek it. For my constituents, that matters not just as a policy for the UK government, but for the people on the ground who are our neighbours directly affected. May I have a few of those precious moments of the Minister's time to help offer them just a crumb of comfort? Because for 30 days they have not heard anything. Both Oded and Ibrahim are at direct risk of harm due to Hamas and the Israeli missiles. Oded, who is the father of one of my constituents who was kidnapped by Hamas, and who the Prime Minister made a personal pledge to my constituent to assist, and Ibrahim, because we do not know as yet why he and his family have not been able to cross the border over at Rafah. May I seek an urgent meeting with the Minister to look at specifically these two cases and find those rays of light we all desperately want for my constituents?
Well, to her point about a meeting, I will see her immediately after this statement. But she will know that the crisis centre in the Foreign Office, which is full of both willing volunteers and experts in these consular matters, will be the right place to take this issue. But I will certainly see her immediately after the statement.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. A doctor sent a message last night from Gaza. We have worms coming out of injuries even after we do surgeries. Nothing is clean, nothing is sterile. It is clear that we need an urgent cessation of hostilities on all sides on humanitarian grounds, because the situation in Gaza is now unspeakable. And at the same time, as well as condemning settler violence on the West Bank, we need more action to see an end to it. Could I bring the Minister back to a question of accountability under international law, following the question from my honourable friend, the member for Sunderland Central? Will the Minister confirm that the government supports the independence of the International Criminal Court and recognises its jurisdiction to address the conduct of all parties in Gaza and indeed the West Bank?
Minister.
Well, can I say to her, firstly, that we are very strong supporters of the International Criminal Court, and that has been true under governments of both the main parties. And in terms of her important point that we need to see an end to settler violence, the government entirely agrees with her.
Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger. My honourable friend for Bradford West set out in the most powerful way why the deaths and trauma experienced by innocent children in Gaza is utterly intolerable. The supply of basic utilities like water, medicine, electricity and fuel needed to operate hospitals in Gaza should not be blocked. It is unacceptable that the siege conditions are still being imposed on Gaza by Israel. Can the Minister confirm that he agrees, and what has he done to communicate that to Israel as a matter of urgency?
Minister.
The government at every level is engaged in those discussions with the State of Israel, and she listed a number of humanitarian supplies which need to get through, and Britain is at the forefront of the international community in doing everything we can, both to make sure that they do get through and to ensure that there are sufficient supplies in the region.
I will check up the time. We will forward the report from Dr. Hassan at the Indonesian hospital in Gaza with regards to the treatment of children with no hands and stage 4 burns. But we've got to remember as well, 30 of the hostages are children too. I believe in immediate ceasefire, but I'm willing to clutch at straws as well. Has the government verified in any form with Qatar, the reports from Qatar, that Hamas might be willing to agree a release of civilian hostages for a 5-day ceasefire? And has the government engaged at all in the proposal by the families of the hostages for an all-for-all release of hostages for prisoners in Israel?
Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman is a very senior member of this House, and he knows that I cannot give him a running commentary on hostage negotiations. But I can confirm to him that Qatar has been exceedingly helpful, and releasing the hostages remains at the very top of our list of priorities in this dreadful situation.
Steve McCabe.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I hate to disagree with my right honourable friend, but I'm not sure we can exactly trade hostages in this condition. However, does the right honourable gentleman agree that the immediate release of the hostages would go a long way to enabling the conditions for the kind of humanitarian pause or pauses we need if we are to be able to get the level of aid in the manner and on the scale that we all think is necessary?
Yes, Mr Deputy Speaker.
John Trigger.
Thank you very much. And as a person of Jewish heritage, I was mortified and horrified by what happened on October the 7th. But I did not for 1 second believe that any Palestinian child anywhere was responsible. And yet, the General Secretary of the United Nations has said, Gaza, he said, is a graveyard of children. And he said that the Israelis are committing war crimes. And finally, he's called for humanitarian peace. Now, we helped to create the United Nations. We are permanent members. Isn't it time we got behind the General Secretary, who speaks with great moral authority on these matters, and ourselves called for a ceasefire?
Hear, hear. Mr Deputy Speaker, the British role at the United Nations is second to none in terms of trying to stop what is happening in Israel and in Palestine. But the point I would make to him is that Hamas knew exactly what they were unleashing on that dreadful day of October the 7th, and the blame for what has happened should be allocated precisely where it rests.
Sultana.
Gaza used to be described as a prison camp. That's what Prime Minister David Cameron called it in 2010. This week, the United Nations Secretary-General called it a graveyard for children. More than 10,000 Palestinians have been slaughtered in Israel's assault, nearly half of whom are children. It would take nearly 6 hours to read the names and ages of every child killed so far. But this horror has been given the green light by this government. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, today I tabled an amendment to the King's Speech calling for an immediate ceasefire and move back by 76% of the British public. So I asked the Minister, will the government finally do what is right and demand an immediate ceasefire to end the bloodshed?
Minister.
Well, while the Honourable Lady is eloquent on the effects, she is not so eloquent, in my opinion, on the causes. And in respect of the amendment which she has tabled, of course, that is a matter for the House, but it will not be supported by the government nor by her own front bench.
Alison Phillips.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I have had approaching 1,200 constituents in touch with my office demanding a ceasefire now. Oxfam have said that humanitarian pauses and safe zones are simply not enough to address this humanitarian crisis, and they're by far the only ones calling for this. Can he explain to my constituents and to Oxfam why he won't support a ceasefire?
Minister.
Well, I'm not going to try your patience, Mr Deputy Speaker, by repeating what I have already said. But when she says that pauses are not enough, there haven't been any pauses yet, and that is why we are working so hard to try and achieve them.
Kate Osmond.
I thank the Minister for his statement today, but I really would like to know how is he going to ensure that the humanitarian aid that he has assured the House will get to those in Gaza will actually get there, because we are getting reports that there are hospitals within the north that only have 24 hours worth of fuel. We are seeing and we are hearing the horrific reports of children dying, and for those who are trying to work under these horrific circumstances, I really want to hear from the House what we are doing to help these people, because it's too much. We're crying, we're upset, it's going on and on and on, and we're having statements in this House, and these statements are not enough. People need to know that we care and that we're going to make a difference.
I don't think, Mr Deputy Speaker, there is any doubt that across the House we care deeply about what is happening there. And she asks about how we will achieve access for humanitarian aid. She makes the point quite rightly that it's not getting through in anything like sufficient quantity at the moment, and that is why we are doing everything we can across the international community, across the humanitarian sector, to try and ensure that these pauses are implemented and take place as soon as possible.
Thank you. So
Sir Roger. We're seeing a humanitarian catastrophe of unfathomable depths unfolding on the world's youngest population. Last week, the UN General Assembly voted on a resolution calling for the immediate, full, sustained, safe and unhindered humanitarian access of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, as well as an immediate and sustained humanitarian truce leading to the cessation of hostilities. The United Kingdom abstained, but it was supported by countries including France, Spain, Belgium, Switzerland, New Zealand and 115 other nations. Why did the UK abstain? If a similar resolution comes again, will the UK vote for it? And does the UK support Pedro Sanchez, who put in motion the Council of European Union to hold a peace conference after the conflict is finished? Does the UK join that call of the European Council?
Well, if another motion comes before the United Nations, then of course Britain will look at the terms of that motion and will discuss it together with our allies and like-minded countries who want, as he does, to see an end to these dreadful circumstances. In respect of the last motion and the decision by Britain not to oppose it but to abstain, he will have seen the reasons set out by the government why we took that decision. But in any new motion that is put before the United Nations, we will vote in the way that we think is best in these dreadful circumstances.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Minister has said, the Secretary of State has said that he's discussing with partners how to increase the amount of aid going into Gaza and that the humanitarian pauses must be part of that. But how long must a humanitarian pause be to live up to the name? Infrastructure needs to be repaired, an enormous amount of aid needs to be shifted in a very quick time. So is there a consensus with those partners on how long a humanitarian pause has to be?
Minister.
He makes a very good point, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but these are the matters that are subject of intensive negotiations at this time.
Thank you. We know multiple respected humanitarian organisations on the ground in Gaza and Israel have called for a ceasefire of all parties. We know historically ceasefires break down and are maintained again only with international support and pressure. So how many horrors, how many deaths do we have to see before the government believes we will see that pressure coming from the international community? And could the Minister clarify if, as he said at Dispatch Box, he believes that multiple humanitarian pauses are achievable on all sides? When will that hope be transferred to a permanent, lasting ceasefire?
Hear, hear.
Well, while it is not, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the policy of the government or the opposition front bench to call for a ceasefire, we are calling for comprehensive humanitarian pauses to enable us to reach civilians in the desperate circumstances which she has described.
Stephen Farrell.
Thank you very much. I concur with the calls for a ceasefire. Since the 7th of October, an estimated 39 journalists have been killed in this conflict. That makes it the most deadly month for journalists in almost 30 years. What more can the government do to talk to the Israeli government to stress the importance of both safety for journalists and also their safe access? Because accurate reporting of this is so crucial.
The honourable gentleman is entirely right to raise the point about the number of journalists who sadly have lost their lives. Many very brave journalists are in the area trying to ensure that we get accurate reporting of what is going on there. They risk their lives in that respect, and Britain will continue. It has done when my honourable friend, who is now the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was Foreign Secretary. He specifically implemented a number of changes to try to defend journalists who were caught up in these sort of difficulties, and the British government strongly supports the work that he then set in train.
McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In the scale of human suffering from the attack on the 7th of October to the offensive in Gaza, we are drawn to the children who have been killed, injured and who continue to suffer. Now, the Shadow Foreign Secretary has asked the government to provide for a coordinator for aid to be appointed. Will the government meet that request?
Minister.
Well, we are certainly considering that as the situation evolves, but for the moment I should explain that there are very many specialists fulfilling a whole series of different purposes and different work in connection with the international situation.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The humanitarian suffering in Gaza is unimaginable, and a humanitarian pause for aid is desperately needed to save lives. Now, the UK has played a unique historical role. Therefore, can the Minister say what steps the Government is taking to support UNICEF and others in protecting the million of innocent children in Gaza?
Minister.
I thank her for her question. UNICEF is one of the most highly respected United Nations organisations and agencies that we have. Britain has consistently been one of the most generous and strong supporters of UNICEF precisely because of the effectiveness of this organisation. So she may rest assured that we will work very closely throughout this period with UNICEF and that we profoundly respect the abilities and reach that UNICEF brings to its work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, a mother and 5 children, all UK citizens and my constituents, finally made it out of Gaza, having experienced sights that no child should witness, literally walking past hundreds of dismembered and decaying bodies to reach safety. If war crimes have committed, they should be investigated. So will the Minister answer the question he's definitely avoided so far and say, does his government say there is a role for the International Criminal Court in investigating the conduct of all parties to this terrible war?
Minister. The point, I don't think it's fair to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I was avoiding the question. I was making the point, which I know he will understand, that Britain was one of the earliest countries to support the ICC, not supported by Russia or China or America, as I recall. And so Britain's support and enthusiasm for the work of the ICC should not be in doubt.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's heartbreaking to hear of the fear and terror that caused 1.5 million people in Gaza to be displaced. Does the Minister agree that the right of return to their homes for that 1.5 million Palestinians having to flee is vitally important for long-term peace, especially given the history in the region? Has the Minister raised this in his diplomatic meetings, and what response has he received?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we all hope that eventually the position in Gaza will be radically different from what it is today, and that the two-state solution will be implemented. And the two-state solution means Israel is able to live behind secure borders, and the state of Palestine emerges from this. So the answer to her question, I think, is a fairly qualified yes.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for his statement and for his clear commitment to look out for the innocents in Israel and Gaza and to find solutions, which is very clear what the Minister wants to do. It is understood that the Egyptian government have opened the Rafah crossing for dual nationals to evacuate the Gaza Strip. Many have already taken advantage of this. Can I ask the Minister what steps will he and government take to ensure that British dual nationals are guaranteed safe passage via the crossing in order to get back to the UK and that reunion, that much-loved reunion with their families? Thank you.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his comments. He always, on humanitarian matters, speaks for the House. Can I tell him on that subject that over 150 British nationals have now come out. All our country-based staff and dependents were out by last night. There are 32 British nationals who are waiting for clearance there, and 48 British nationals who have been cleared and who, when this statement started, were waiting to come across. So that is the current position. Like him, I hope that any of his constituents who are caught up in this, he will use the MP's hotline to the crisis centre so that we can give him the most accurate information that is available.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The charity Medical Aid for Palestinian people are struggling to find food, water, basic needs, and that even the minimal humanitarian aid that has been allowed in isn't able to be distributed fully due to the damaged roads and lack of fuel for trucks. And the north of Gaza is basically receiving no aid at all. So can the Minister set out how the government is working with international partners to ensure the urgent fuel and humanitarian supplies are not only getting in but also throughout Gaza to help those in desperate need?
Well, the Honourable Lady quite rightly draws a distinction between getting humanitarian supplies into Gaza and then being able to distribute them safely. Those are very challenging circumstances for the reasons that I have set out to the House, but she may rest assured that the international humanitarian community is doing everything they can to address them.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank
Mr Deputy Speaker. The World Health Organization estimate that there are 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza, with on average 180 giving birth every day without access to obstetric services. And of course babies being born into a war zone. So can the Minister just outline what work is going on to make sure that humanitarian aid is getting to those pregnant women, new mums and babies?
She describes an extremely difficult situation, one that has been ventilated in the press, where we have seen that women are having to give birth in the most hideous of circumstances. What I can say to her is that if we are able to get aid in, we have specific humanitarian aid and support for mothers of babies, for mothers who have just given birth, and we will do everything we can to meet the need when we are able to get access in that respect.
Wilson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Thousands of children are dead. Many more are traumatised. Millions are being starved. And as we've already heard, the UN has described Gaza as becoming a graveyard for children. We all agree that Israel has the right to respond to the senseless and brutal attack of the 7th of October. But many of us, including hundreds of my constituents, believe that that response is utterly disproportionate. With the UN, the WHO and the lead prosecutor of the ICC warning of breaches of international law, will the Minister explain to the House what it will take for his government to stand up to Netanyahu and his extremist ministers and make clear that this abject suffering simply cannot and must not continue?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, because we are strongly supportive of Israel's right to self-defence, and we have been absolutely clear about that, as have the opposition, throughout these dreadful circumstances, we are able to have clear and firm discussions with the Prime Minister of Israel, and that is what we do.
Gwen.
Thank you. I abhor the loss of all innocent civilian life. Dead innocent Israeli men, women and children, and dead innocent Palestinian men, women and children have this in common. They're innocent civilians and they're dead. This vicious cycle of killing must stop. But as we're here to talk about the humanitarian situation, before recess, the Prime Minister told the House that he would use British logistical capacity to be able to get hundreds of aid lorries a day across the Rafah crossing, rather than the tens of lorries a day that were occurring at that time. By when do we expect that target to be met?
Well, he speaks for everyone in the House when he abhors the loss of life, and the loss of life by innocent civilians, of course. And when he turns to the humanitarian situation, he refers to what the Prime Minister said before the recess, and what the Prime Minister said is absolutely correct. Not only has Britain been supplying humanitarian provisions into Al Arish so that it can go through Rafah when the circumstances permit, but also we have provided heavy lift materials so that others, as well as us, can move those supplies towards Rafah when they are able to get through. So I think what the Prime Minister told the House, everyone, not just Britain, but everyone, is trying to achieve.
Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary for the work that they have done to help facilitate the safe departure from Gaza of my constituent, Mr Abdul Hamad. Mr Hamad was in Gaza to perform kidney transplant operations as a charity volunteer with Liverpool International Transplant Initiative. I would like to pay tribute to his many years of humanitarian work in this field. As we know, there have been thousands of deaths in this terrible conflict. So can I ask the Minister, will he urgently press all parties to agree to an immediate de-escalation and cessation of hostilities? And will he do all he can to bring about a peaceful resolution to this devastating conflict?
Well, I'm not sure that I can add in respect of her last point to what I have already told the House, but I am very relieved to hear about her constituents, and I will pass on her thanks both to the Prime Minister and to the Foreign Secretary.
Kat Smith.
Speaker. The only route to long-term peace is a two-state solution, and the Minister has said in response to other questions that Gaza will look radically different at the end of this conflict. But can he commit to making representations to his Israeli counterparts that all those displaced in Gaza will be able to return?
She rightly identifies the importance of getting back to the two-state solution. That is the policy of the British government and has been the policy of repeatedly of British governments. And in terms of the well-being of the people of Gaza and their future, she may rest assured that Britain, along with its allies, is absolutely focused on that. And it's very important to make clear that Hamas is not the Palestinians.
Richard Burton.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. To tackle this humanitarian crisis, we need to strain every sinew for a ceasefire. The UN General Secretary says we need a ceasefire, one binding on all sides. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights says we need a ceasefire. So too does the head of the UN's Office for Humanitarian Affairs, the head of the UN Children's Fund, of UN Women, of the UN Food Programme, of the UN World Health Organization. In fact, the heads of all major United Nations agencies are calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. Why does this government think that it knows better than the world's leading humanitarian agencies?
Well, again, Mr Deputy, I'm not sure I can add to the very comprehensive and full answer which I've already given the House on that point, but let me make it clear that it is not the policy of either the government or the opposition to call for the ceasefire for the reasons I have set out, but we are all of us engaged across the House on trying to bring these dreadful events to a close.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I agree that the need for humanitarian pauses is urgent. And with that in mind, can I ask the Minister what discussions the government is having with regional partners, especially Egypt, to ensure that the Rafah crossing will allow for many more people to leave Gaza much more quickly? And can he, further to that, assure the House that when it is safe to do so, they can return quickly and safely also?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her support for humanitarian pauses. She can rest assured that we are having chats with discussions, detailed discussions, with all our regional partners. And in respect of Egypt, which she mentioned specifically, I had a discussion yesterday at around midday with the Egyptian ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. In depriving the civilian population of Gaza of water, food, medicine and power, combined with the forced relocation of civilians, not respecting the sanctity of hospitals, indeed bombing or threatening to bomb hospitals, and targeting civilian infrastructure, including refugee camps, Israel has broken Articles 3, 18, 23, 33 and 47 of the Geneva Conventions. What exactly does the IDF have to do before this government calls out Israel for its war crimes?
Mr Deputy, I wouldn't accept his analysis of the Geneva Convention there, but when he talks about the need for water, for food and for medicines, he may rest assured that Britain in its humanitarian efforts is focused very much on those supplies.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. In 2014, a 6-hour pause made way for a 3-day pause before a ceasefire. This House must be on the right side of history, and I absolutely respect the Minister for the time and the tone of the debate today. But would he agree with me that for lasting peace, we must inevitably reach the point of a ceasefire, even after humanitarian pauses? And will he assure me that he will press that with our international partners to ensure that we have lasting peace in the region?
Well, in spite of the Honourable Lady's very generous comments, I cannot agree with her for the reasons I've set out about the calling now for a ceasefire. But I hope that she will feel that the government's intention, along with its partners in respect of humanitarian pauses, is moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I understand the need for Israel to act to free the hostages and to deal with Hamas, although the images we see and the numbers of children that are killed can sometimes seem a very distant way away from those objectives. And in respect of the latter of those aims in relation to Hamas's capacity, I'd like to know, how does the UK government judge whether those objectives have been reached and whether we reach a point where we say to Israel, that's enough?
I recognise that he is being supportive in saying that the purpose of the Israeli government is to free the hostages and to deal with Hamas. And I'm sure this won't be the only occasion when I come to the House to give a statement about both the humanitarian position, but also the position throughout Gaza.
John Cherry.
Thank you. When so many children are being horribly maimed and killed, it really isn't naive to call for a ceasefire. And that's why so many international voices are calling for a ceasefire, including my friends at the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute. And they've done that against the background of an assessment that the rules of international humanitarian law have not only been broken by Hamas, but may also be broken by the Israeli government. Now, I was very disappointed to hear that the UK government have not carried out an assessment of whether or not international humanitarian law is being obeyed on the ground in Gaza. Could I suggest to the Minister, and this matters terribly to my constituents, many hundreds of whom have written to me about this, could I suggest to the Minister that if the UK government fulfilled its obligation to carry out an assessment of whether international humanitarian law is being obeyed on the ground in Gaza, then it might change both the UK government's mind and the mind of the official opposition and make them support a ceasefire now.
The Honourable Lady is, I think, a distinguished lawyer, and she will know that the judgment that she is asking the government to make is not a judgment for ministers and politicians, it is a judgment for lawyers in respect of international law. And so I fear that I am not in the position as a minister to give her a direct answer to her question.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Minister for the way he's conducted himself this afternoon in terms of listening to the wide range of concerns from members and right honourable members. And my prayers and thoughts remain with those hostages who've been kidnapped for over 30 days now, and they have to be released safely and urgently. I've received so many emails from Vauxhall constituents who are really concerned about the ongoing humanitarian situation in Gaza. And I recently met with Islamic Relief UK, who are based in my Vauxhall constituency, and they shared with me the harrowing story of their aid workers on the ground. None of us has proper food. We are struggling to find water. We have no electricity. Humanitarian assistance is not being allowed into Gaza, and I fear that people will starve there. Minister, this is a quote from an Islamic Relief staff member who fled Gaza South with his family. These calls are real. These calls are now. People need desperate help. People are facing a major crisis. What more will the Minister and this government do to make sure that they are speaking to their Israeli counterparts, for them to make sure that pause is real, that pause comes now, so that we can get that urgent assistance, so we don't see more innocent civilians dying?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady speaks to the House about the importance of achieving the humanitarian pauses, which have been greatly mentioned over the last hour and a half. Can I say to her that I know Islamic Relief extremely well. I've visited them in her constituency, and they do fantastic work, and we all honour and respect them for that. In her contribution, Mr Deputy Speaker, she talked about the importance of releasing the hostages and addressing humanitarian concern. Those two things are at the heart of what the House is discussing today, and I thank her for ending this session on a constructive note.
Well then, at the start of this session I expressed the hope that the House would rise to the occasion. I've not been disappointed. And could I particularly thank the Minister for the courtesy and the time that he's given to this session. Order.
Order. Order.